Hello everyone and welcome back to OverPlay, the only show that combines the thoughtful critiques and criticisms of an overview with the spontaneous insanity of a Let's Play. And while there's probably a good reason for that, we don't have time to talk about it today because we have to talk about Immortal Unchained. Now, on the surface, this just appears to be Dark Souls with guns set in the future. And you'd be right. But there's a little bit more to this than what most people would see to this, and because of that, and mostly to the fact that I'm not a huge Dark Souls fan, I decided to bring in some outside help.
You baby back bitch.
And that is my brother, back again, if some of you recall from our Dark Souls 3 review, who defended it to his dying breath.
Well, actually I died several times in that one. But It's not my dying breath, and I didn't have to defend it. It defends itself.
That being said, we're here to talk about Immortal Unchained. Now, honestly, I'm not too sure what exactly the story for Immortal Unchained is, besides escape this bizarre prison planet that you've been locked onto, which, that's very Dark Soulsy. I'm down for it. And that's about it. Which is perfectly fine for a game like this. It works well, simple enough, and it gives you a clear-cut goal. Now, the big hook, obviously, is going to be for the people who enjoy Dark Souls the way it is. The challenge and the punishment, the grind, etc. And, for the most part, that appears to be there, at least in my opinion. But, kicking it over to somebody who may seem otherwise, what do you think?
I don't have too many issues with what you just said beyond that it's the grind for the grind's sake. In this one, it's a little bit more accessible to walk through the enemies quicker. In Dark Souls, a lot of times you would have the reach out and touch you aspect of enemies having, a rushing attack, lock on. The map being designed so that you really can't get by them without, running afoul of their techniques. And this one here, because of the way that they've got the projectile system put together, the way that they built the area around you and how your character interacts with that, you get a little bit more accessibility to just running past the enemies, provided you can maintain awareness of where they're firing at. And that's actually how we got this far right now. This is already post-boss number 2 from the opening area.
Yes.
You got a couple extra weaponry. Pick up your quote-unquote armor stuff as you find these different shrine items.
About to say, I don't think they can see you air quoting through the audio.
Yeah, I was going to have to automate that. The biggest difference, I would say, from standard Dark Souls to this is more in the polish of it. It's a smaller production company by far.
Well, this is their first big solo production. Just about everything else they've done has been either with a studio or via something else.
Right. My guess would be that they got contracted to take up an aspect of previous games that they've worked on, which would make sense. I mean, you get hired on by someone who does the bigger part of the industry together.
Yes.
Obviously, it's still punishing like Dark Souls is. It's not as much of a shooter as I would have hoped when you pitched it to me. As, hey, here's this, shooter Dark Souls.
Yes.
I was picturing something on the lines of like almost the fast-paced dyingness of Battlefield or Call of Duty.
It does feel a little sluggish in some places. I will admit that.
Right.
And I'm not sure if that's not by design, though.
I'm sure it is. You can't stray into the territory of Dark Souls and still run a traditional shooter style, because otherwise you end up with this weird little bastardization of FPSs that is Destiny. And love it or hate it, I don't think it quite captured the best of either one of the genres it was trying to get into.
No, not by a long shot. Out.
This one, because they isolate the combat to Dark Souls style, combat where you're targeted on, you move around, you have your stamina is a big part of it, trying to avoid attacks. The attacks just happen to be at range now. It adds a element of some firefightiness to it. It maintains the ability to utilize your leveling systems, your upgraded, weapons and things. But it also does give you the liberty of being able to go and freeform shoot like what you're doing right now. For those of you who don't care to do that as much, or for areas where it makes you suffer a lot for doing that. And it has the lock-on method, which he's utilizing now. Personally, I stick with that because it's reliable and it'll work. I've played a lot of Dark Souls, and you trust your targeting system. You learn where your ranges are at for things, which for here, obviously, a bit more awareness is needed for that, given that some weapons have shorter range and some weapons will have longer ranges. I do think that some of their interactions in combat are rudimentary, as far as like your melees are very simple.
It does feel very much like I don't want to say unpolished, but very much a lesser version of what Dark Souls strove to be. From Software has generally...
Foot trap.
I didn't see that. From Software has generally been really good about their polish on their games. As much as I don't like them, the controls and mechanics are very much exactly what they are meant to be.
Yeah, and if you look back to Dark Souls 1 even, the motions that you have when you were doing your melee attacks earlier are actually pretty reminiscent of a basic longsword in that one.
Yes.
So to that degree, I think it's... They knew where to give up the ghost, so to speak, on trying to upgrade and build upon, given whatever limited resources they might have. They focused mainly on what was their bread and butter, which would be the semblance of range combat that they're working with here, which they did a pretty good job with.
Yes.
I don't have too many complaints.
The shooting actually feels fairly tight for a third-person game like this. I wouldn't expect it to be as decent as it is.
Yeah. One thing I am grateful for is, as far as I've seen anyway, I haven't used the sniper class, nor have I used any of the weapons on it, which, it's just part of it. I don't know that they have first-person shooting in this, where you're aimed down the scope.
From what I played with it, it does not.
That's actually...
So you're pretty much kept at over-the-shoulder view.
Right. That's kind of a benefit to this, because previously in games that I've played, they're like, oh, we're third person, but you can aim down the sights as well. Every time you go to aim down the sights, the perception and the angle of where you're looking at in the game changes. Oh, and by proxy, your aim gets thrown off every time you go down range like that.
Right.
And obviously, you're not going to run into that with this.
Not quite as much, hopefully. I'm kind of jumping into this from his playthrough, and I'm a little unfamiliar with the terrain. I do not suck. I'm the best. I'm the one who reviews.
You give Hoover lessons.
The FBI director?
No, Hoover's the vacuum cleaner. For all you youngins out there who think of, is it Shark?
Dyson.
Dyson's?
Dyson's.
What's the shark one? Sharknado?
Sure, why not?
Close enough.
That being said, the controls I kind of wanted to touch on because they're awkward.
Yeah. What's the number one button that you would pick for dodge in any game, no matter what it is?
Usually I'd go with either B or A, and it's fortunately B here.
I would have said A all the way. B has never been a dodge button for me.
I've played more than a couple of games where that's the case, so it's not really unfamiliar to me. No, the big one is the weapon switch, which is, at least for those of us playing with a controller, down on the D-pad, which is kind of awkward. Which means that if it's awkward on a controller, it's probably going to be a fairly awkward key binding as well.
Do they even have this on the PC?
I believe it is on PC, yes. So,
you got blowed up.
Bunghole.
You know you have a grenade, right?
Yeah, I know.
Just solve the problem.
I will eventually, but every time I go to reload, I end up swiping my sword.
Now that is something I fell victim to a few times, and it's gotten me killed at least once that I know of. To a point, you can just chalk that up to, get familiar with the controls of the game.
Which is always an acceptable answer. But at the same time...
It is, but when everything else about it seems to fall in line with every other, third-person shooter style.
Click in to run, Y to heal. Again, it feels very Dark Soulsian in a way. The controller scheme does.
That would explain why you're dying so much.
It really would, because I'm not good with Dark Souls. I'm just going to admit that. Outside of the control bindings being a little awkward, I don't really find anything too upsetting about this game, control-wise. At least when you're playing. Now, as far as the environment goes, yeah, there's some parts where it could use a little more elbow grease on. As you saw earlier, there's the portion where I accidentally walked straight into a bottomless pit of water because the floor to the water didn't load until I got close enough, which unfortunately was right on the edge. There's also more than a couple of issues where you go to try and attack somebody, and unfortunately they just kind of slip and slide all over the place, which kind of brings me to my next semi-issue, which is the visuals. Now, first of all, I love the visuals for this, for the most part. It looks wonderfully gothic and desolate. Like, this is sort of what I envisioned a lot of Destiny looking like. A very run-down, semi-destroyed, also very lived-in world, though. And when I heard this described as Dark Souls with guns, I kind of thought exactly this, and it absolutely measures up to what I was thinking it was going to look like. And I have zero complaints about the overall visual aesthetic of this game. I think it looks really cool. Maybe a little too edgy for some of the character designs, especially some of the player characters that you see. They're basically all interchangeable as far as your class goes, looks-wise. So I really don't understand the purpose of having separate classes, because you can acquire any kind of gun when you go through. So there's really no... I don't want to say no point to it, but it seems like there's less of a necessity to pick a different class besides the one that shoots the most. And then you can tailor out how you want the game to play past that.
A big part of Dark Souls, though, is very similar to that as well. There's one class, technically, that you can always go with that is the best way to start out, depending on how skilled you are with the game. But for anyone who's new to the game, obviously you're going to be like, okay, I want to run someone who's got more health, or I want to run a fast character who can dodge more. I like to use magic, things like that. I think that their different class systems are functioning on a very similar level to that. So that it's not necessarily going to change the long game, but the short term, early access stuff is going to change drastically. Because the character that I start out here is the, what was it? It was the Vanguard or something. It works with the carbine. And so the stats that he starts with basically bar him from being able to access the shotgun, the sniper rifle, and there's one or two other weapons there that just happen to need the kind of stats that he doesn't carry starting out as that class. Over time you can build them into it, but until that time, then you stick to what's in your class. You get familiar with that style of combat. Similar to how in Dark Souls you had to stick with either a knife, a rapier, a long sword, whatever it was you were handed for a while, until you got enough strength built up on your thief character to start running around with a giant freaking glaive.
I suppose that's understandable. But at the same time, it rather feels unnecessary in a lot of ways. Which, I could be totally wrong, and that's just me coming from a position that doesn't enjoy this particular kind of game, so I'm perfectly willing to admit that. Getting back on track to the visuals, though, the only real problem I have is there are portions of this game where it becomes very evident that they just allow certain assets to drop into the frame. On a number of occasions, I've seen creatures roll out of the way, and it's very obvious they are not interacting with the world. There's not really an easy way to describe that. You came across a body floating in the water, and when you went to fire on it to make sure it wasn't an enemy, it became very, very apparent that it was just that, because you could see the water explode from underneath your character, from underneath the body of the character you were shooting at.
Yeah, it had the little splashing effect going 2 different directions at once.
Yes, which I am willing to chalk up to, it's their first big solo game for the most part. I'll let it slide. I'm not going to complain too hard about that.
Yeah. Honestly, overall, I enjoy... I mean, we've only seen this one area here, and then the initial training area. And really and truly, I like their level design so far.
Yes. It's sprawling, but it can get confusing. There are some issues where you have to melee your way through certain areas, and it's not quite clear what's rubble that can be meleeed apart and what can't be, so you just end up slicing your sword against a large wall for a long time until you find that one spot that's open to you. Which, I don't have a problem trial and error trying to figure out where to go, but there are some points where it really does help having at least moderately clearly defined pathway as to where you're expected to go. I won't say should, but where the game would intend to lead you.
Part of that I would chalk up to at least my experience with having played the Dark Souls style games. Dark Souls 1 and 2 were both very much a wander around and figure it out as you go kind of games. Well, I'd say that Dark Souls 1 was a little bit more linear. There's more, you go back and forth along the same stretch of area, and find different, directions you can take based on how much you accomplished at the time. Dark Souls 2 was real bad about, as you got further in, the sprawl just being so ginormous that you'd get lost. I actually had to look up how to finish the freaking game at one point because I gotten, so far into it. Did a couple side missions. I was like, all right, where the hell am I supposed to go? I completely forgot. This one, I don't see that being as big a problem. Their level design is good, and it's got uniqueness to it, but it doesn't have the same size as, say, Dark Souls has built into theirs.
Yes.
There's a little bit more controlled.
And honestly, I really do hate having to keep referencing Dark Souls this much, because this game should be able to stand on its own as its own game. Unfortunately, so much is lifted heavily from the Dark Souls brand and style, it almost becomes impossible at a lot of points. And I hope with what you've seen, that becomes conveyed. Through all of this, though, I kind of like this game. While I'm not a big fan of the Dark Souls aspect of the grind for the sake of the grind, I can get behind the visuals and the overall gameplay being radically different from a standard Dark Souls style game. And if I had my choice, I would definitely play this more. But again, the one or two little things that really could have used some more polish, the characters interacting with the world, a few of the configurations, the way sometimes the gunplay isn't quite as consistent as you really hope it would be sometimes. You noticed early on that there was wild difference when you would fire at your enemies, and sometimes you would hit and other times it would just fly past them without too much of a reason for that.
Sometimes, yeah. To a point, I mean, I chalk that up to like whatever weapon you happen to be using at the time. But there are points, of course, it's one of those things you run into with any shooter where the vector of where the game's seeing you aim at and where you're seeing yourself aim at, plus or minus the variance for recoil and all that, there always seems to be a little bit of that gray area where it's like, wait, but I was aiming here and you're sending it off there. Okay, whatever, we'll move on. it's never been enough to where it's like, okay, I shouldn't have gotten destroyed by this enemy here because of this one shot, which is a nice thing, because in the other RPGs and stuff where you'll play with this style of combat, but it's all, swords and sorcery, you suffer way more for one mishap of, game calculation or your mistakes than you do in this game. It's far easier to be able to recoil yourself from those mistakes and recover, which I appreciate.
I will agree. I will agree, actually. That being said, in my honest opinion, this game is absolutely worth checking out. That being said, if you're a fan of the Dark Souls style games, if you're not, this game probably isn't going to do you any tremendous favors in ingratiating you towards that kind of a game. That being said, if you've never checked one out and you're not really into the whole swords and sorcery type aspect, this is definitely a really good way to start, especially for people who are more familiar with third-person shooters than they are hack-and-slash games. And for that, I would 100% recommend renting this in some way, shape, or form.
Most definitely.
Well, that's going to about do it for us today. But please try and remember, as always, these are merely our opinions, and opinions are subjective. What did you guys think? Have you played this? If so, did you like it? Do you think it's a giant pile of crap and that it should just be left to From Software to make games like this for the rest of eternity? Leave a comment down below, and if you enjoyed what you saw here, consider giving us a like and a subscription. Always helps the channel out. And until next time, we'll see you later.